Hello, this is Randy K7AGE with part 3 of my ZZRX-40 40-meter kit build. And before we get started, I'd just like to review the deal that the Four States QRP Group has made for Ham Nation viewers. The Foursquare QRP Ham Nation deal saves you about $4.50, but to take advantage of this, do not order on the Foursquare QRP page. You order by sending $47.30 to orders at 4sqrp.com and put a note in the PayPal that says Ham Nation Build group discount for the ZZRX-40. If you have any questions about the ordering, please send an email to Johnny, AC0BQ, at jomatlock@gmail.com. And this offer expires December 31st, 2016. While you're watching this video, if you like it, please press the like button. And if you haven't subscribed, and about 80% of my viewers are not subscribers, please press the subscribe button. You can also follow me on Twitter at K7AGE and on Google Plus at +K7AGE. I'll be working on the kit based on what's on the instruction manuals, pages 3 through 5. I'm going to solder on the second IC socket, some capacitors, resistors, the voltage regulator, and I'm going to finish up by doing a couple voltage checks. So let's get started. In my previous video, I soldered on the first socket, and now I'm going to solder on the second socket. And here's the instructions of what to do. But basically, we want to make sure that the U channel on the socket lines up with the little U symbol on the printed circuit board, because this identifies where pin 1 is. Okay, I'm going to hold the socket from the bottom side of the board with my finger as I bend over a couple of the pins in the opposite corner with my X-Acto knife. And this will help ensure the socket stays on the board. Every time that I solder, I take the iron and I just clean the tip here in the sponge. All right, I'm going to solder one pin here in the corner. Again, just a little dab of solder on the iron to help with the heat flow. I can tell the pin's real low in there. So I'm going to now push it up with my finger from the bottom of the board here. And I can feel it seat. You can see the pins all the way up. And now I'll solder the rest of the pins. Just a little bit of solder on the iron to help with the heat transfer. And I just kind of rise the iron up off the pin. And solder these 4 pins now. And I'm just going to retouch this one a little bit. There we go. Okay, the 2 IC sockets are in. The next thing we're going to install 2 2-pin headers. That's these guys here. In the HDR1 and HDR2 locations on the board, just below U1 it says. And the shorter ends go through the board to be soldered. And the trick here is to get these straight. So this is where the 2 headers will mount. And what I'm going to do is just use a little bit of this blue tape. Oops, and see if I can tape them down so they don't fall out when I turn the board over. And I'm going to just solder 1 pin on each one of these, and just the center pins here. And then I'll check to make sure it's straight. So again, a little bit of solder on the iron on the opposite side of the pin, and let it heat up and flow to both the pad and the pin. Then I just raise up off the pin. So these are fairly straight. I'm going to see if I can just touch them up and get them straight. So I'm just going to heat up 1 pin and hold it with my finger and see if I can get it a little bit straighter. And I just flipped it over and checked it, and the one on the right here is now worse off than it was. So I'm going to heat that up again. And it's getting hot, and hold it. And I think that should do. And now I'll solder the 2 remaining pins. Okay, we have the 2 headers on the board, and now it says install the shorting shunts on top of the HDR1 and 2 headers. That's these little black guys. We just take these and just place them down over the pins. Next step is to install the 2 3-pin headers, these guys here. at the HDR 4 and 5 positions on the board, and one is right here and the other one is over here. And I've used some blue tape to help hold those on the board while I solder. Okay, I'm just going to solder the center pin. I'm going to grab it from underneath. Ouch. And hold it straight. And do the same thing with the second one. Push it up to the board and straighten it up. I'll check it, see how it came out. And they look pretty straight, so I'm going to solder the rest of the pins. And we want to take a close-up look to make sure we haven't shorted out between the pads. So this all looks good. Okay, so we've soldered on the 3-pin headers. Now we have to place the shunts on these other new headers. And now we have a choice to make. And since we're going to use the VFO, not the crystal, we want to place the jumpers between the center pin and the VFO. So on this one, you can see it's labeled VFO there and crystal here. On this one, it's VFO down here and crystal up there. So we want to go between the bottom 2 pins and the left 2 pins. Okay, those are done. And now we're going to solder the power input jack. That's this guy here. And it goes up here at the top of the board. And they tell you to solder 1 pin first to make sure it's flat and level to the board, check it, and then solder the rest. And to help hold the power socket in place, I've again used my blue tape. So I'm going to solder 1 pin. I'm just going to reach underneath and push on that to get the jack up flat to the board. And that looks good. And now I'll solder the remaining 2 pins of the power jack. And that looks good. Okay, power jack is installed. Next is U3, the 78L06 regulator. And the instructions say to line up the flat edge of the voltage regulator with the flat edge that's shown on the printed circuit board. And we want to also leave this about 3/16 above the board. So here's where the voltage regulator U3 goes. You can see the flat edge on the board here. And I've bent the leads a little bit to help so this fits on the board here, fits through the holes. Here we go. And you can see how much I'm going to leave that sticking up off the board there. So what you can do now is just kind of spread the leads apart on the bottom side of the circuit board, and it'll help hold it there while you solder. And I'm ready to solder the leads here. Now I'm going to come in here with my cutters and cut the leads off down close to the board. And I usually try and get my finger on there to keep those leads from flying around the room. Okay, the next thing is to install the power switch, which they say is J1, but I don't believe that because that's what the power jack is. And we want to make sure that the switch is seated all the way down on the board. And it's labeled SW1 on the board, so switch 1. And you can see the 4 corner pins as well as the 3 pins for the switch, and you want the lever facing outward, and it pushes in and snaps. And the switch is down tight on the board, so I can go ahead and solder it now. Okay, this may take a little more heat because of the mass of the switch. So I'll just work my way through all the pins here. And there we go. Okay, another step is done. Now we're going to install capacitors C16 and C6. And, I have identified these before. So 16 and 6, these little blue, they're labeled 104. It tells you to go ahead and solder them. So let me pull these capacitors off the board and we'll find out where they go. Okay, so C6 is located right here, and C16 is over here by the power jack. Now when I install parts in the boards, I like to line up the sides with the labels so they're all pointing in one of two directions, either towards the bottom of the board for like this type of part, so I can read it from this way, and with this part here, I'm going to position it so I can read it from the right, in case I ever had to check that to see if it's the right part. These capacitors you can install in either direction on the board. Other parts we have to be sensitive about polarity. So I have C6, and I have the writing towards me, towards the close side of the board. I'm going to push this in, and it's going to go down, and be careful not to break the ceramic. So there's C6 installed. And now for C16. That one dripped right down. And then I just bend the leads over, which helps holds the parts there when you go to solder. And just a quick check to make sure the parts haven't lifted off the board. Now I'm ready to solder. And now I'm ready to solder these two capacitors. And I'm kind of waiting a couple seconds before I touch the other lead to make sure the first one cools down. I want to create a cold solder joint. And now I'll trim the leads. And a little hint is to save these leads when you cut them off, because we're going to have another use for those in a few steps. And we have these two capacitors installed. The next one is C7, one of these 100 microfarad capacitors. So with electrolytic capacitors, these are polarity sensitive, and they have to go onto the circuit board in the correct direction. So here the instructions are telling you to place the positive lead by the positive marking on the board. The positive lead is not labeled, only the negative lead, so we know the other lead is the positive. So here's the capacitor. Plus pin is marked on the board. It's there by the power switch, so we're going to mount it so the negative lead faces towards the outside of the board. So we mount the capacitor again with the minus lead facing the outside of the board. Then I'm just going to pull the leads apart on the bottom and go ahead and solder it. And I'll solder the capacitor now. Just let you know, you guys can see better than I can. I have to look around the microphone and the camera. And there we go. And then clip the leads. Okay, we have C7 mounted, and now we're going to mount C17. It's one of these smaller electrolytics, 4.7, and again to make sure we have the positive towards the plus on the board and the negative on the pin away from the plus. So there's C17 between the power jack and the power switch, and we'll just drop that onto the board. And again, the negative lead is towards the edge of the printed circuit board. I'm ready to solder this cap, and I'll let that cool down for a couple seconds so I don't disturb the joint while I solder the second connection. Now I'm going to go ahead and do that. That's one way to cause a possible cold solder joint, is by wiggling the part while it's cooling down. And another step completed. Okay, we're going to install R3, a 10 ohm brown, black, gold resistor. And I've located that. I've double checked it, that it's really the brown, black. And the way the resistors installed in this kit are straight. They're straight instead of laying down. I call this pump handle. And this is another area that I like to put all the parts on in the same orientation on the board. So the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to put the first color band, the brown, facing up on the top of the resistor. Okay, R3 is located right here on the board, and here's the resistor. And I'm going to bend it with the brown color facing up. I'm just going to bend it around like that. And I'm going to place it on the board. And I'm going to put the body of the resistor over the circle area. And just push that down. And then I'll bend the leads underneath the board so it stays there. And ready to go ahead and solder the resistor lead. One pin, wait a little bit, let it cool down, then go ahead and solder the other. And then cut the leads. I'll use my other cutters this time. Okay, R10's installed. Now we're ready to install R8. This is a brown, black, red gold resistor. And I've identified that and double checked it. And now I'm going to bend that around. And I missed starting the recorder when I was going to show you where R8 is positioned. But as you can see, it's right here on the board. And now solder this resistor. And trim the leads. Okay, now we're going to install two diodes, D1, D2, the one in 5817, and the diodes have a marking on one end, so we want to make sure we get that placed properly on the circuit board. It'll be marked probably with a band as well. Let's take a look. Okay, D1 and D2 are right below the power jack. You can see the banded end is marked on the printed circuit board, so we want to make sure we line up the part with those markings. So that's the way the diode's going to be mounted on the board. I'm going to take my needle nose and I'm going to hold that right about where I want the lead to bend. I'm going to bend that down. And it looked like it was about the same amount on the other end of the diode. It's just kind of the width of the plier. So do that to both diodes. D1. Push down to the board. And D2. Push down to the board. They're both on there. And double check to make sure the marked end is to the right. And ready to solder the two diodes. I'm soldering the two pins side by side, so you gotta be careful you don't bridge between them. But by the time I get back to the first diode, it's cooled down and I don't have to worry about moving it around while I solder and creating a cold solder joint. Now we're going to mount the LED. And we have here this piece of circuit board material. And these are the shims for the LED. And it should just snap apart. There it goes. So we want to break all of these apart. There's 8 of them. Okay, if we look at the base of the LED, you'll see one side here has a flat edge and also a shorter lead. So that's the cathode edge. So we want to place that on these little shims in the same alignment as the silkscreen. And looking closely at one of the shims, you can see the flat spot on the silkscreen. So we want to line all the flat spots of all the shims and the diode together and build the stack. Where I place the LED on the first shim, so you can see the flat edge lines up. So now I just got to stack up the other 7 behind it. Okay, see if I can get all these on there. There's number 2, number 3, 8. Okay, so here's where the LED goes. Again, you see the flat spot is down at the 7 o'clock position. Get in there and put the leads through the holes on the board. Boom. And there it is. It's going to be kind of floppy until we get it tight and soldered. So I'm going to kind of hold it. And I'm bending the leads on the bottom a little bit. And now turn it over and solder it. Okay, I'm going to solder one lead of this diode, of this LED. Then I'm going to reach from behind. I'm going to push up on it. Get it hopefully square on the board. And I think that looks pretty good. Yeah, I think it's enough play in there that they'll always kind of move around, but they seem to be stacked tightly. So I'm going to flip it back over and solder the other lead. And I'm just going to kind of push on that again. There, it just slid up just a touch. Should be good. And cut the leads. Okay, the LED's on the board. Next page, what's next? Okay, it says it's now time for a power check. Make sure the power input to the ZZRX is working properly. There's two ways you can power the kit. One is by using the power jack, and the other is by using, if you have one of these four AA cell battery holders, you can wire them to the battery pack to HDR3. Now, you kind of are stuck at this point a little bit because they do not include a plug to go into the connector here, nor do they include the battery pack. Those are items that you have to get. So I'm just going to power my kit with a 9-volt battery, which would go into J1. But I'm not going to hunt around and dig up a power plug at the moment. So I'm just going to solder the wires on the bottom of the board where the pins for the power sockets. So the positive pin is the center, so that's the pin towards the center of the board, and the ground is over here on the side. So I'm going to tin these wires, just put some solder on them so we can stick them on the board. Oops, that's too much. Okay, so here's the power jack, and this is the pin that was at the back. So this is the positive, and this is the ground. So I'm going to solder, just tack the red wire. Okay, so I'm just going to heat this up. Just tacking. It's not a. This isn't permanent. I'll get a connector for this. Okay, that'll get us going. It says here, if you're using the power supply or battery option, apply 9 to 13 volts to the power input jack. Well, I've soldered on my battery clip. Use a voltmeter to make sure you're getting around 5.9 to 6 volts on pin 8 of the dip socket U1 and on pin 6 of U2. And a convenient place to connect your multimeter ground is the ground pin of header 3, which is where you could solder on the battery pack for the 4 AA cell battery. Move the lever switch towards the power jack, and the LED should light when power is applied. Let's give that a try. Okay, I have these small micro clips on for my voltmeter, and I can get that on the ground pin on the header 3, which is the bottom pin. And for the positive lead of the meter, I'm just going to use one of the cutoff leads. So let me connect up the battery. Okay, we're ready to make our voltage check. We have the battery hooked up, and I can go ahead and turn the switch on. Hey, the LED lights up. And we want to check on pin 8 of U1. So pin 1 is up here in the top left corner, and it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So pin 8's opposite pin 1, and got 5.94. They say I should have between 5.9 and 6 volts. And they want you to check on pin 6 on U2. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Second one up from the bottom on the other side. And again, that's 5.94. So, success. It powers up and works. So I'm going to call that a wrap for today. We've made it through pages 3, 4, and most of page 5. We've installed a bunch of parts on the board. We learned how to do sockets, headers, resistors, electrolytic capacitors, and diodes. And we made a voltage check and everything passed. Now, if your kit does not pass these voltage checks, you have to stop and figure out why. You may have a part in backwards. You may have a solder bridge. You need to figure it out before you go on. Otherwise, it'll be very difficult to fix later. So, I'm ready for the next part here. We'll keep building the kit. And thanks for watching. This is Randy, K7AGE.